Brilliant. I think that means we are live. Can you give me a wave in the chat if that is correct? Or I could just start talking and hope for the best. Okay, there's a woo. Lovely. Thank you so much, everybody, for joining us to this event, an event that I've been looking forward to ever since I heard of this book's existence and had an inkling that I would be able to blag my way into chairing a discussion with Robert with the Lighthouse. So thank you so much to the Lighthouse, firstly, for putting this on, and just a reminder to everybody in the audience to always support your local indie bookshop. Lighthouse is based in Edinburgh, and they're an amazing queer radical leftist space, and they deserve your love. So tonight we have the pleasure and the honor of being joined by the incredible Robert Jones Jr. Robert is a writer from New York City. He received his BFA in creative writing and MFA in fiction from Brooklyn College. He's written for numerous publications, including the New York Times, Essence, and the Paris Review. He is the creator and curator of the social justice media community Son of Baldwin, which has over 230,000 followers across platforms. So please join me in sort of virtually welcoming and clapping Robert into the room. I think we should just take a moment, Robert, to imagine the applause, imagine the excitement, feel the love. How are you doing, Robert? How are you feeling today?
I am doing well, considering all that is going on in the United States and in the world with us dealing with this pandemic, a return to this sort of deeply conservative right-wing rhetoric and actions. Despite all of that, I am somehow here, and I'm thankful.
Absolutely. I think we can all resonate with that. And not to bring the tone down, but you look absolutely incredible. Your outfit is popping off today. I feel like had I not been in the middle of moving flat, I would have tried to match with some sort of braces and fun jacket attire, but you've got the casual shirt today. I'm aware that we don't have loads and loads of time for this conversation, which I'm sure the two of us could chat for ages. I'll just give the audience a bit more background into who the hell I am. So I'm Jess Brough, and I run a reading group, a book club for Black queer people called Black Unicorns. It was originally based in Scotland between Edinburgh and Glasgow at the Lighthouse in Edinburgh and Categories Books in Glasgow. And since the pandemic, we have moved into a virtual space. So it's been an amazing way to connect with other readers outside of Scotland, but also to connect with authors like yourself, Robert, who are seas and miles away from us. So our most recent book that we discussed was the incredible book that we're going to be talking about today, The Prophets. It doesn't actually say The Prophets on my front cover because this is proof, but we've got it on the spine. Beautiful. Thank you, Robert. And I guess I just wanted to kick off the conversation with you by asking you a question from one of our group members, Titi, who wants to know when the book came to you. How long have you been writing this? How long had you been writing this book?
From the very first time that I picked up a pen to start sketching it out to the very last moment my editor, Sally Kim, and I decided it is done, time to go to printer, was 14 years.
Wow.
The idea came to me probably in my senior year of undergrad in 2006, where it was just kind of flitting around in my mind, but I was sort of afraid to write about it because I knew that it was a sensitive subject and that certain people might be offended by the ideas that I was thinking about, queering this history that had heretofore not been queered. But then in my first semester of grad school in that following fall, I was in a course called Fiction Tutorial with an author by the name of Stacey D'Erasmo. And she gave us an assignment in which we had to find objects that a character we were thinking about might possess. And I'm walking along a street in Brooklyn, and there's a pile of garbage that a store put out on the curb for sanitation to come pick up the next day. And in that pile of garbage is a pair of shackles just kind of laying on the ground. And so I go over to them and I pick them up, and they're heavy. And I said, maybe this is this character that I'm thinking about telling me that he would like me to tell his story. And so from that bit of thing, I gathered other materials like pictures of some of my ancestors from the early 20th century and late 19th century, photos of them, letters, birth certificates, things of that nature. I sort of gathered all of these things to sort of have this ancestral energy around me as I started to craft this character, what he looked like, how old he might have been, the texture of his hair, the width of his nose, the fullness of his lips, what he liked, what he loved, all of these things, until I came up with a character by the name of Hannibal, who would eventually become Isaiah. And then eventually Simon, who would become Samuel. And that is the very beginnings, October 2006, of what would eventually become the prophets. And then it was called Sing Hannibal, Bear Witness. That was the working title at that time.
Mm-hmm. That title actually makes sense to me, because so much of this book feels like a call to listen. It feels like somebody is telling you to lean in and really listen to the history and listen to a way that they're offering you a way to work through the position that you're currently in. And, you know, I wrote one of the things that one of our book club readers said about this book, May. She said, I didn't care who was speaking to me, but I knew I needed to listen. And you get that sense straight from the very, very first page of this book, that sort of calling to you to pay attention. It's such a beautiful aspect of this book.
Oh, wow. Thank you.
Something that I really want to explore with you, Robert, is your choice of language in the story. So correct me if I'm wrong, but at no point in the book do any of the Black characters describe any of the white characters as white. We have all these other terms. We have some are funnier than others. I think I have my particular favorite is skinless, which I think could become even more regularly used in the discourse than it already is. What was the thinking behind doing that and using words like tubab? Apologies if I pronounced it wrong.
You did. Yeah. It's right. Tubab, yovo, skinless. In African American vernacular, there are even more terms. Peckerwood, cracker. There's like so many other terms. What I wanted to do was sort of demystify whiteness and remind readers that white is also a race. And if I just refer to them as white, it almost, whiteness is constructed in a way such that it sort of purports to be the default state of humanity. And so when one is referred to as white, it's almost as saying human being. So I wanted to disentangle it from that and have the Black characters in particular be able to bring it back down to earth and give it its real meaning, which is if you are going to race us, we can then in turn race you in ways that you have no control over, using our own language, not the language you gave to us. So that was why tubab was the preferred use, which I think is a Wolof word that means to convert. And that was, to convert was really important because of the religious underpinnings of what that means. And so I used that word very particularly in these descriptions. That
use of biblical or religious terminology is something that a couple of our other Black Unicorns members found particularly interesting. And they wanted to know, so this question comes from Kyle and Lucy. Why did you use to refer to each chapter? For anybody who hasn't read the book yet, has a different biblical reference, a name, or a part of the Bible, a section of the Bible. I'm not well versed in the Bible, so I'm using all the wrong terminology, but you know what I mean. What, why did you choose to use these biblical references, but also who are the prophets in this story, and where did you get the? There are also particular names in the book from important West African references as well. So I'm interested in sort of your merging of those two things, the biblical references and also these beautiful West African names.
In terms of the Christian aspects, the biblical aspects of the book, my underlying intention was to critique Christianity, but also show the reader the ways in which Christianity changed us as African diasporic people from our previous practice in the European Empire in particular ways, because we did have many countries on the African continent did establish trade with certain European nations prior to the colonial project. However, in this particular instance, I wanted to show what the Christian indoctrination did in terms of separating Black people from their native spiritual systems and their native cultural practices and their native understandings of existence, nature, and all of those other things, and juxtapose it against what wound up happening to us in regard to slavery, and how that Christian indoctrination sort of led us down another path, in some ways making us look at our previous practices as somehow inferior or primitive or something to that regard. And then in terms of the African sections of the book, what I did was a lot of research on what was it like to be a native indigenous African before any substantial sort of engagement with what we think of as the West. What were the dances like? What was the singing like? What was the love like? What were the ideas about gender? How did we get names? And naming is a really, really important thing in the book, because one of the more subtle aspects of indoctrination during this time is we're going to take away your native name and give you a Christian name as another way to have control over you or to subjugate you. And so that is why I went and I looked up particular West African names or Central African names to figure out how these characters in these chapters should be named, and how the naming practices worked in some African tribal cultures and things of that nature. So basically, having the African and having the American sort of holding up mirrors toward one another to show this is how we were degraded, and this is what we were like sort of before the degradation began.
I have something to respond to that, but before I do, I got a little bit ahead of myself, and I forgot to mention to the audience that there will be a chance in the last 15 minutes for us to take some audience questions in addition to my own questions and the questions from the Black Unicorns reading group. So you can use the ask a question function that's somewhere near the bottom, and you can use that whenever, and I'll take a look at that when we're ready for audience questions. I'm so glad that you touched on that, Robert, because one of the reasons why this book feels so important to me and really moved me and has continued to move me when I think about this reason is, for a long time, I felt like I've been searching for that knowledge and that history a book that would come along and sort of map out across the world the different examples of queerness or of gender that doesn't follow these very westernized binary rules. We understand a little bit about, I say we as in people who are outside of the following cultures, we understand a little bit about two spirits and the third gender and Native American cultures and the Hijra in India. And we know that men married men and women married women, and people didn't even conform to those two genders across the African continent. But I feel like I've been waiting for a book that really spelled that out and mapped that out. And I thought that book was going to be nonfiction. But the first instance that I had of somebody really doing that through art was a play by a Black English writer called Temi Wilkie called The High Table, which is it's an amazing play, and I hope that at some point you'll get the chance to see it. But
I hope so.
These two Black Nigerian British women who've decided to get married, and one is really struggling with how she's going to talk about this with her family, who she doesn't think will respect it. And the interesting thing about the play is that we get these main characters who are actually that woman's ancestors in the ancestral plane. And one of those characters is this amazing Black woman who was sort of this big, strong leader when she was alive, who also back in her day was in what we would call a queer relationship now, but obviously back then that language would be different. And I think for me, that was the first time that I saw art really speak to that history, speak to that search, and say these concepts have existed for a very long time. And then your book came along and took that for me even further, and I feel like I learned a lot from myself from this story. So yeah, I think that's very powerful, the way that fiction can actually be used to tell truth in the way that sort of nonfiction tries to as well. One of our questions from our group is from somebody called Jade, who is a historian who has a particular interest in your research process, as you were sort of touching on just now, and wants to know a little bit about that research process. So where did you look to find these names or these dances or these practices and these examples of how love was made and celebrated in West Africa?
I went to the source. I went back to various African scholars to see what they were writing about their own histories with their own villages and tribes and such. There were some Western things that I looked at but it seemed to be like a step removed because there was a Western gaze on these practices. And so I wanted to go more to the source. And what I found was most valuable was the oral histories. Mm-hmm. So for example, Esther Arma from Ghana, who's a brilliant artist activist, she talked about how, if you asked my great grandparents, and I think her tribe was Ga, she said, if you asked my great grandparents, what is a homosexual? Do you have that? They'd say no. But you would walk away as a Westerner thinking that meant, okay, there are no homosexuals in Ghana. But she said, had you told them what you meant when you said homosexual, they would have said, oh, you mean love. Because for them, there was no, that culture, there was no need to separate transgender or gay or lesbian. All of it was part of the landscape. It was all part of the culture. It was all natural. And her exact words was something like, love was like the land. There were no boundaries. And so that sort of freed me because that was the crucial information that I was looking for to be able to say, because I don't know if people are aware that in the United States, there was a sub-segment of Black communities that feel as though queerness is a result of the trauma of slavery, that we were on the continent of Africa, the whole gigantic continent of Africa, people were only cisgender and heterosexual, and that's it. Men and women, that's it. And it wasn't until Europe came that all of a sudden we were like, hey girl, but no, that is not.
The flags came out.
Right. And so I wanted to sort of get at the heart of that, because what's really underneath that is this sort of patriarchal masculinity trying to assert itself by insisting upon men being in boxes, women being in boxes, and there be nothing in between, and that everything is binary and under the control of the patriarchy. So what I found in my research was, for the most part, what happened is when Europe began to invade and began to colonize and began to send their Christian missionaries into these geographic spaces, they were disgusted by the idea of genderlessness, of non-binariness, of queerness that they encountered, which they called sodomy and all of these other words at the time, that they forced their worldview onto these peoples, which is where we get the genesis for many of these situations of anti-queerness and such. And so I wanted to sort of speak to that sort of thing. And the research was extensive. Like I read on the American side of things, all the slave narratives, anything I could find about that period in history. I was an Africana Studies minor in undergrad. And then on the African side, I went straight to African scholars, and I went to the oral histories of African elders who were still speaking and remembering and passing on that sacred knowledge to get a full understanding of the differences. And then in forming this tribe, which is a fictional tribe in this book, the Kasango people, I took bits and pieces from all of the tribes that and cultures that I was learning about, and combine them so that it presented a strong contrast to what we were understanding in the West in terms of sexuality and gender and things of that nature. So, for example, the Guardians of the Gate, Kosai and Alewa in the Kasango tribe, that concept comes from the Dagara people of what is now Burkina Faso, where their queer members of their society were considered guardians of not just the literal gates of the village, but guardians of the gates between the here and the hereafter. So that was like one of the concepts that I used, and so that's kind of how it came together.
Amazing. Can I ask why you chose to create a fictional tribe rather than sort of using one that already existed that you knew about?
Because if I wanted to use like one particular tribe, I felt like I didn't have the authority to say, I'm going to write about these people that are outside of my experience. And then I thought that would open me up to so much criticism about how dare you write about something you know nothing about. Whereas if I created a fictional tribe and took proven factual elements of each tribe that I read, I could maybe not tell the facts, but I could get at the truth of the differences between African traditions and Western ones.
Yeah, that makes complete sense to me. Thank you. One of as a group, obviously, we loved Samuel and Isaiah as, kind of, I suppose I want to call them the main characters of the book, but they're not necessarily. We can talk about why I'm struggling with that in a bit. But we also particularly loved the character of Sarah. And I think it's really interesting that you gave us this character who knew exactly who she was and was still very much connected with her knowledge of her ancestors and her knowledge of her past, but was so... I'm hesitant to use the word reluctant, but really wasn't open to sharing that knowledge with whoever, with just anybody on the plantation, especially about her own queerness. Could you talk to us a little bit about Sarah's character, please?
Sarah was a character that I had to fight to include because the editor, the agent, the publisher, they didn't really see why she was important to this narrative. So what that said to me was like, okay, so then I need to rewrite her section such that you understand why this character is crucial to this narrative, because she stands apart as the woman who is not interested in patriarchy. She's not interested in a male-directed society. She is only interested in her liberation, period. She was crucial to understanding woman without proximity to malehood, getting value from that. Mm-hmm. So for me, she's probably one of the most important characters in the book. And so in order to give her own sort of identity and reason for being, I did additional research. So I looked at Denmark Vesey, who led an unsuccessful revolt in South Carolina in the 1800s, and about his trajectory of how he came to the United States and how he found the courage to lead a rebellion. And then I did some additional research about the Dahomey Amazons, as they're called. You know, Amazon is not the right word, but that is the term that people refer to them as, to sort of formulate what Sarah's childhood could have been like, what her journey could have been like, who she would have loved, and how she would have defended herself because of this long line of powerful women that she was descended from. And one of the interesting concepts that I discovered was about how some of these ancient African societies looked at gender in such a beautiful way. You were a girl until you decided otherwise. That, like, and science kind of backs that up, because we're in the womb, we all start out female until some other chemical is introduced and we become male or something else. But we all begin as girl. And that was such a beautiful idea to me that I wanted to make sure that I included that, and that Sarah would be the one to say, damn it, we all start as girl. The rest is determined by the spirit. And so Sarah is one of my favorites. And I'd like to think that she actually survives that battle at the end. In my imagination, she wins. Readers might come to another conclusion, but in my imagination, she actually wins.
I chose to take that perspective too. I was stubborn about it. That's so beautiful to hear, because we really did love talking about Sarah. I promise this isn't just a talk where I'm trying to get people to join book clubs, but one of the best things about the book club is that, you know, you may be grappling with certain characters or certain themes that maybe you didn't love as much as the others, or you didn't understand, and you really need to talk through it with other people. And for me, that was the character of Amos. I really struggled to like him as a character. I found him very complicated. I didn't really understand or necessarily trust his word on why he did the things that he did. And for those who are listening and who haven't yet read the book, Amos is an important character because there's a big rift in the story where Samuel and Isaiah, who are these two black men who are in love and who nobody else on the plantation has really bothered about their relationship until Amos sort of comes along with religion. He is also enslaved on the plantation, and he gets the Bible from Paul, who is the owner of the plantation, and starts preaching to the other enslaved people. And I'm sure you will be able to sum this up much more eloquently than me, Robert, but it's a really fascinating turn in the book, because then you start to see people turning against these two young men. And I suppose it's interesting because, somebody said, spoilers hit. No, don't worry, that happens quite soon at the beginning of the book. It's quite early on, don't worry. It's sort of the theme of the book. And I won't go into detail about why Amos did what he did, but the reasons that he's sort of giving to himself, sort of this idea of doing it for the many rather than the few, is not something that I necessarily appreciated at the time of reading. It's something that I really had to understand through talking to the other members of the group. I guess I'm interested in your reasons behind Amos's character, and did you think at all about sort of the intense sadness that comes with thinking that you're doing the right thing in the moment, the idea that, you know, you're protecting your immediate community from something that the white plantation holders are going to fight back against anyway, sort of in order to protect your community. But what we know now in 2021 is that we've had this long, long-lasting legacy of homophobia within the Black church, outside of that as well. But sort of that's potentially the genesis of where that's come from. Perhaps you could speak a little bit about that and about Amos's character and why we should maybe give him a chance.
Amos, as you said, is a complex character because he really does think he's doing the right thing, but there is also a level of self-deception there because he knows the risk that the Tubab can't be trusted, and that even if he does this thing, there's still the risk of harm coming anyway. But he feels as though he might as well take this shot if he has it in his power to do something, because he's thinking about it as, I don't live up to this patriarchal standard of malehood or masculinity because I can't do this thing. I won't spoil what that thing is. But if I can somehow use my wit and guile, maybe I can put myself in some sort of position, maybe of not ultimate power, but of a particular kind of power to accomplish what I want to accomplish. But here's the rub. I have to sacrifice two people that I love in order to do it. So how do I convince them to go along with this? Especially since there's this other person who is like rising up in opposition to me to try to prevent me from doing what I need to do. And he, for me, does represent in many ways what the Black church has become. Because the Black church was not always a site in which the other was persecuted. It used to be a liberatory space. Denmark Vesey in the African Methodist Episcopalian Church once was a site where they plotted insurrection and rebellion against the plantation owners. But the problem is that Christianity always returns to form. And since the form of Christianity that we learned at the tail end of a whip was an oppressive form, it always becomes the oppressive form. So it went from being something possibly liberatory because of the blood memory of Africa that we retained. Because if you notice, the way Black people practice Christianity looks and feels different than the way white people do it. But there's always this element where the religion only works if somebody is the enemy or if somebody is oppressed. And so first it was the Black woman. The Black woman has to be made secondary. The man has to be primary. Then so now that person now needs someone's throat to step on, and that becomes the Black LGBTQ plus person. That is now the one that has to be stepped on. And that is the paradigm of Christianity. And Amos sort of embodies that in many ways, because here's Paul, his master, who used the religion to enslave him. And now here's him using the religion to oppress Samuel and Isaiah. And that is how it is passed on. When whomever takes on this religion, this is what happens. I'm not saying this to say that all Christian practices do this. I don't know that all Christian practices do. There are some that are accepting and liberatory, but they are also always on this whole paradigm of redemption and sin. And this idea of sin, I think we really need to interrogate. And the idea of enemy, we really need to interrogate, because it's always the powerless that we are saying are the enemy, and it's never the powerful. Because I'm under the belief that there's a difference between power and empowerment. Power is dominion over other people, and empowerment is dominion over myself. And I really like the latter. I think the former is inherently corruptive, and leads us down dangerous paths. And so I like Amos as a character. I don't know if I necessarily trust him, but I also understand that he is trying to survive. And so I judge him with trepidation.
I love that a writer can say, I don't trust this character. At the end of it all, when you finish writing it, there's still a little bit of mistrust in that. I think that's brilliant. I'd love to talk a little bit about sort of the form of the novel and the way that you've kind of written this in 3 different sort of voices. We get the present voice of what is currently happening, and we also get these other voices in this more sort of abstract poetical prose that you give us from, is it the ancestors, is it somebody closer? That's another topic that we were kind of discussing in book club. And I suppose we sort of want to know, and this particular question comes from Layla in the group, why did you choose to structure the book in that way? And once you made that decision, how did you go about doing it? Did you write the sort of the more poetic ancestral voices first, or did you return to those later, or did they guide you through the narrative that you were trying to give us on the plantation?
That is a great question. The novel in 2006 started out as being told from one point of view, but I kept running into roadblocks in terms of story. I couldn't advance the story when it was being told just from one point of view. So then I tried to tell it from two points of view, the characters that eventually became Samuel and Isaiah, and still that wasn't wide enough. And so at some point I made the decision that a group of characters should have their own points of view, all pointing back at Samuel and Isaiah, witnessing this love, whether they were inspired by it or angered by it or whatever, telling us something more about Samuel and Isaiah with them at the center. Then I had a dream where I woke up out of it, and I keep a notepad by the bed, and so I scribbled down some words that I remembered from the dream and went back to sleep and forgot all about it. The next morning, woke up and came to the computer to sort of work on the manuscript, and flipped through the pad and saw what I had written the night before. You do not yet know us. And I said, that sounds like a direct address. Is this ancestral? Are the ancestors saying they need to have a voice in this, that they need to talk directly to me, or directly to these characters, or directly to the reader? And so I said, okay, I'm going to follow this. And so I
find an answer to that.
Yes. So I'm writing, right? And I write the "You Do Not Yet Know Us" chapter. And so then that leads me to the second chapter. And then I'm like, oh, okay. So what's going to happen is this ancestral voice is going to come in and out. They're not going to be here the whole time. Sometimes they're going to be in chapters with the character, where the character is having a moment of sort of spiritual possession of a sort, and they're going to talk through that character. But they're going to show up kind of behind. But in some chapters, it's going to be them talking directly to us. And then I said, and then when I started doing that, it was that ancestral voice that led me back to Africa, because they said something to the effect of, this is not the beginning, but this is where we shall begin. And I interpreted that to mean that we don't begin at slavery. Slavery is not the beginning of our story. That is, it's not your sin. That belongs in the hands of Paul, Ruth, Timothy, and James. here's where you come from. Let me tell you a little bit about that. So here I am trying to make all of this work. And at first it wasn't. It was feeling like every chapter was its own book. And I said, I don't know how to do this. So I went and read Toni Morrison's Paradise, because she has that book being told from various points of view. And I was like, well, it feels cohesive. So how do I do it? And then I read Ayanna Mathis's 12 Tribes of Hattie, where she was doing something very similar. And then I said, okay, I know what I have to do. I'm going to have to pull out some of these chapters that are not working and rewrite them or leave them out completely, so that this book, the reader is rooted in either Empty or Kasongo Village and understands how those two narratives mirror each other in a lot of ways, and how Kosai and Alewa lead us to Samuel and Isaiah. And then the rest of it was just revision, trying to tighten it to make it seem as cohesive as I possibly could, working with my editor to pull out some things and put in some new things to make it feel more congealed.
Right. Could you, and I mean, it's beautiful, and it definitely comes across as one form and one, and multiple voices that are in communication with each other. It's really masterful how you did that. I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit about Maggie's relationship to those ancestral voices, because I see you smiling. Maggie was also a group favorite, and we also were talking about how refreshing and wonderful it is to see a Black man be so good at writing the voices of Black women, because that doesn't always happen, we have to say. And those characters were just so beautiful throughout this book. So firstly, thank you for that. But also, yeah, what would you say was Maggie's relationship to those voices?
Maggie is the character that threatened to take over the entire book. She was the one that spoke to me most clearly. The one that was like, no, don't do that. That's not how it happened. Do it right if you're going to do this. I remember Toni Morrison saying that Pilate almost took over Song of Solomon. And I understand now what she meant, because Maggie, like, she's the character that invigorated me the most. And I can't take credit for how, if these characters are perceived as well written as Black women, I really have to give credit to all of the Black women who I read. Zora Neale Hurston, Toni Morrison, Alice Walker, Gloria Naylor, Edwidge Dandikat, Toni Cade Bambara, just brilliant Black women writing, and me just studying their works to make sure that I got this right. And also turning to the women in my family and observing them. My sister, my younger sister, Crystal, my mother, my great aunts, just listening really closely to what their grievances were, what their joys were, how they moved, their vulnerabilities, their strengths, so that I could say that when I come to the page to write these Black women, I am giving them their full humanity, their perfections, their flaws, their strengths, their weaknesses, all of it, because they're human. I'm not going to come and Mary Sue them and make them all virtuous or make them all vixens, quote unquote, the vixen characters. They're going to be fully human people, because that's what they are. And Maggie is the one that sort of helped me understand the other women, because she was sort of the leader, and she was the one that most remembered the old ways, because her mother, my dear, told her, "Don't you ever forget these things. If you don't remember my words, remember your blood." And so, because she remembers, they commune with her the most. Sarah remembers too, but Sarah's position is, well, they don't want to hear this shit, so fuck them. But Maggie's like, no, you got to make them hear it. So that's her position. But Yeah, and she's also the one that sees Amos for who he is. And she's like, no, you're not going to do this. You are not going to do this. Yeah, Maggie is the character that most people say that was my favorite character in the book. And she threatened to become the book. She really did threaten to become the book.
Yeah, she's definitely going to stick with me for a very long time. Maggie and Sarah together.
Someone said in the chat, Maggie Hive.
Maggie Hive, yeah. I'm here for the Maggie Hive. One of the things that you actually mentioned at the beginning of the event, and I can see that actually a couple of people came in a little bit later, so I'll just sort of paraphrase. But you mentioned briefly that you had a bit of trepidation or a bit of fear about writing what you were writing, and perhaps that contributed to the length that it lasted you writing the book and that process of getting it published. But I guess sometimes I think about all the Black queer writers out there who have written or are writing stories that are not queer. They're perhaps they're settled in they're within the sort of various areas of our different Black communities, but they're not queer. And I guess I wanted to ask you if you ever think about the impact that this book is going to have on those Black queer writers, who perhaps didn't feel brave enough to tell those stories, but have seen, this incredible reception of the prophets and your own experience with putting those words out there. Do you think about the impact that this book will have on those writers?
That's heavy. I can tell you that the thing that meant the most to me after this book was published was that a 17-year-old Black queer person messaged me on Instagram and said, Mr. Jones, this is the book I've been waiting for. That means more to me than any review, any other praise or whatever that this book receives. Because when I wrote this book, I wrote it with Black LGBTQ plus people specifically in mind. All Black people in general, but specifically Black LGBTQ people, to let us know we're part of the landscape. No matter what your pastor says, no matter what your parents say, no matter what the politicians or the police, whomever with the letter P says, president, whoever, you have a right to exist as you are. You belong to the human family and you deserve respect. That is the lesson of this book for me. And that is the lesson I hope people get out of it. And I hope that is its impact. I'm so far removed, especially now because of the pandemic, from engaging readers to really know and understand how people are receiving this work. So I don't know what impact it's actually having other than, the occasional email here or there. But I'm hoping that that's the impact it's having on people's lives, particularly Black LGBTQ people. And I'm hoping that it inspires others to say, shoot, he told his story, I'm telling mine.
Yeah. Yeah, I see a comment from Titi. We all felt that. I can tell you with total sincerity that I felt that too. And in preparing for this event, I found it quite scary because this feels like a very important moment for me and for, I'm sure, plenty of Black queer people out there who have been waiting for this book and have been waiting for someone to just proudly say this is our history for a very, very long time. And centering that in love is just such a wonderful choice that you made. I wanted to ask one more question that comes from the group before we move on to audience questions. And as a reminder to the audience, if you haven't yet posted your question in the Ask a Question box, please do. We'll have time for a couple before we finish tonight. But this question comes from Jade. And Jade wants to know how you were able to cultivate such beautiful moments of joy and care in the group, in the book, you know, and not reproduce at the same time the same harm of brutality as was in slavery and is in the situation that the book is placed in. How did you manage to, how did you give us so much love in a book that is so deep and painful in parts?
Part of it was in reading so many slave narratives, in reading works about antebellum slavery, like Beloved by Toni Morrison, where I think that's like the first work where I see the genius of Toni Morrison is where she is ensuring that slavery is the backdrop, not the main character. So many works about this time period make slavery the main character. The degradation of Black people is the main character. What I wanted to do is like what Toni Morrison did, is give the enslaved person an interiority so that they could have a humanity, so that you can understand these people as people and not as slaves, because slave is the erasure of humanity, the subjugation of the person into some lower state. So there are no such thing as slaves. And in that way, I say they are enslaved, meaning somebody did this to them. This is not their condition. This is someone else's condition. So I said, in order to do that, I'm going to have to ensure that I know and that the reader knows that despite all this stuff that's happening to them, all these burdens that are being imposed upon them, they still had joy in the nighttime. Samuel and Isaiah, Maggie cooking, Sarah remembering Mary, Pua dreaming about this other place where she is waited on hand and foot. Auntie trying to mold herself into a shape at which she can get the most comfort. Amos feeling powerful. They are going to still find moments of joy because that's what humans do. When we are facing adversity, we look for the first thing that's going to make us feel better. So why deny that to these people just because they're enslaved? I'm not going to deny them their humanity. And so at the heart of this had to be untold love. Sarah telling Pua, girl, she loves her. You know, that's like her, like a younger sister to her. She loves her. Or Maggie scolding Isaiah. That's love. And that these moments of love and intimacy had to play a crucial role, particularly because this was such a rough, terrible period in history. And I had to make clear that slavery and violence are synonymous. So to give the reader something else, I had to show the abundance of love and care.
And that's such a beautiful place for us to just take a breath while we head to the just resettle the spine, wipe the clammy palms, take a drink while I open up the questions. Thank you so much so far, Robert, for your generosity with my questions so far. Okay, we have one from Fanula. It says, hi both. Can you recommend any non-fiction books that would be good companion pieces to the novel? So I've already kind of cheated and half answered this question by recommending that you, if you can't see The High Table by Temi Wilkie on stage, which none of us can at the moment, seek out the playbook, buy the book of the play and get that. It's an incredible play. How about you, Robert?
I would say to read Flesh and the Devil by Kola Booth. Kola Booth is a Sudanese Egyptian writer who is absolutely brilliant. And hers is some of the work I return to sort of understand the African parts of the book and African cultures during certain time periods. Flesh and the Devil by Kola Booth would be an excellent companion piece to the Prophets.
Beautiful, thank you. And we have a question from Serendipity 3. I don't know your real name, I'm sorry. How do you get to that place as a writer that allows you to get into the headspace some of the more troubling characters. I guess you'll have to interpret what they mean by troubling characters, but I want to know the answer to this question as well.
Paul in particular, the plantation owner, was a difficult journey for me, because what I had to do at the outset was say, I can't hate any of these characters. I don't necessarily have to love them, but I can't hate them, and I have to understand them, and I have to allow them their humanity. Even the one representing the person who, the people who destroyed or tried to destroy my ancestors. I have to even have sympathy and empathy for him, and that was hard. And I had to rewrite his chapter probably more than any other part of this book, because I couldn't stand him. And I was like, no, you can't write from a place of hatred, because it'll come through on the page. He'll come across as a caricature, and it'll drag down the novel. You have to find his humanity. That was hard. And so what it required from me was a lot of sitting still, a lot of understanding this is art, and I can't let my personal feelings about this particular character interfere with the art of it. And I also had to listen to him, give me his excuses for why he is the way he is. And I had to not only listen, but I had to hear and say, okay, I will write this down. I will write this down. But it was very hard. A lot of moving away from the novel and putting it down, a lot of meditation, a lot of walks through parks to sort of restore myself with some tree energy, and just eventually saying, I have to surrender to this process. I have to let Robert Jones Jr. sort of take the background and let the testimony speak for itself.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Thank you for that. We have a question from Titi, who's also in the group, who is asking about character names. And not to be rude, Titi, we have talked a bit about that already. And Robert, I don't know if you wanted to expand on any of the names at all, but also Titi, this will be available recorded very soon after the event finishes. I hope that's okay. But on that kind of note, maybe this is what you're asking, Titi. Maybe you could tell us, Robert, who are the prophets in this book?
Everybody, including the reader. The prophets are the people that tell us something crucial about the way we live such that we can be better. So it is the ancestral voice. It is Maggie. It is even Paul and Amos, because they're showing us how we shouldn't be, or they're sort of cautionary tale about what happens when you oppress other people, what becomes of you when you oppress other people. So everybody in this book, Semjula, King Akusa, all prophets in some way, because they are telling us something about the essential condition of humanity in a way that we could hopefully learn from and make then a better us and a better world.
Beautiful. And just to finish, Robert, before we head off, I'm wondering if you could give those of us who are listening advice on what to do if you have a story that you are scared about exploring, or a truth that you're scared about writing about. What would you say to those writers, as somebody who's been through that process?
I would say this. There are going to be so many obstacles to your finishing this work. There are going to be so many people telling you, you ain't no good. Nobody wants to read this. Why do you have to be so Black and LGBTQ? Do it anyway, because your voice is necessary. And the people who are telling you that, the reason why they're telling you that is because they don't want your testimony out in the world, because it implicates them. They don't want to be implicated. And so you have to tell this story and be clear. You're going to be scared and fearful the entire time, even after it's done. Do it anyway, because someone told me, the definition of courage is not being fearless, it is having fear and doing it anyway.
Mm-hmm.
So that is what you have to do. And you're going to have that inner voice. Like I still to this day have the inner voice telling me I'm not good enough. You are good enough despite what that inner voice is telling you. Write it down anyway, because we need you to do it. It is your purpose.
That is so beautiful, and what an amazing way to end such a brilliant and just gorgeous event. Thank you so much to Robert Jones Jr. Thank you to the Lighthouse Bookshop, and thank you to everybody who came along. And I'm like looking at the chat box as if that's where the audience is. It's so thank you for coming along to listen to this amazing event, and have a wonderful evening.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you so much, Jess. Thank you, Lighthouse.
Bye, everybody.